So thank you for joining us today for our fourth and final session in our BI and Analytics Strategy Series. We'll be talking about defining processes to enable proper governance today. My name is Amanda Teschko, and I'm a Business Intelligence and Analytics Consultant with Thorogood. I've been working with Thorogood for a number of years on enterprise BI strategies and implementations, and I'm joining today's webcast from our Philadelphia office. I've got my contact information listed on the screen there, so if you have any questions about today's session or coming out of the session, please feel free to reach out. So on our agenda for today, we'll start by just giving a quick introduction to Thorogood. Then we'll talk a bit about what we mean by processes and governance and why they're important for your strategy. We'll look at some key considerations for that strategy, and then we'll share with you a sample approach that we've taken with a number of customers now to help them define governance within their organizations. So for those of you who don't know Thorogood, we are an independent global professional services firm. We specialize in business intelligence and analytics strategy solutions and services. We've been doing this for a little over 30 years now. We are a global company, so we have offices in London, New York, Philadelphia, Singapore, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and Bangalore in India. And we do offer a full range of BI and analytics services. So that includes everything from strategies and roadmaps, which we'll be talking a bit about today, as well as full implementation, so from requirements through to implementation, as well as training and support. And I think you'll see this today as I walk through some of our sample approaches, but our philosophy at Thorogood is really strongly rooted in ensuring that any technical solutions are delivered in a way that gives careful consideration to the breadth of technical possibilities, but is really strongly guided by the business goals and the value. We do work with a number of blue-chip customers drawing from a range of sectors. The sectors we most commonly work with are consumer goods, pharma, life sciences, financial services, and insurance. And this list will just give you a sense of some of the customers that we've worked with when I'm drawing from examples today. And we are an independent consultancy in that we work with a range of technology partners, and our consultants are knowledgeable and experienced in a wide breadth of technologies, and really the way those technologies can be integrated successfully in enterprise applications. I've listed some of our partnerships here, including back-end, front-end, and some of the analytics-driven technologies that we work with. So now that you have a bit of a background in Thorogood, I thought I would start today by really talking about what we mean by processes and by governance. So because we hear those words, governance and process, used in a range of different ways, I thought let's kind of set the stage with the definition. So what do we mean by process? We're going to be taking that definition pretty literally today. So any series of steps that need to be taken to achieve a particular end. So basically, how do you get from point A to point B? What are the tangible steps that need to happen in order to get you there? And so why is process an important part of your strategy? Well, if we think about our BI strategy in terms of three components, we think about it in terms of data, and these would be the sources of information in your company. So you can think of sources that might be stored in various places or in various ways, but by this we really mean the kind of physical lines of information that exist in your company. The tools, so you can think of this as the technologies that facilitate your analytics, your reporting, your code management, any technologies that you have to employ as part of this strategy. And then the people, which people often think of in terms of as users, but it's also members of your IT organization, your senior leadership, different stakeholders. It's really anybody who plays a role in the process of organizing, sharing, and consuming information. And so when we're thinking about our BI and analytics strategy, we think about those discrete areas, but also, and maybe more importantly, the overlap of those different areas. So the intersection of people and tools, or the intersection of tools and data, as well as that little part in the middle, that's the intersection of kind of all three of those things. And we know that in order to make any of those three elements work and work together successfully and in harmony, there are really a number of processes that have to be defined and managed behind those elements to make them all work smoothly. And so it's really important when thinking about your strategy to also consider what those processes are. Now, I would say that we have seen customers fall into a bit of a trap with this, in that you could map out every single process that's associated with every element of this, and that may be kind of tedious or take you down a bit of a rabbit hole. But what we would suggest are to really focus on the areas where there might be gaps. So there might be a gap because it's a new process that needs to be put in place. So for example, if you're rolling out a new tool and you need to determine the onboarding process or how you'll determine which users can use that tool, you may want to kind of bubble that up as a high priority. Or places where you know that you have a process in place today, but it's not working as well as you want. So for example, I would say many companies at the moment are really kind of reevaluating their DevOps strategy. So looking at better ways to manage changes to code. So rather than kind of getting bogged down by every process that might exist, if you really look to give proper emphasis to ones that are new processes that are needed or existing processes that you know need to be augmented, that can make this a little bit more manageable. And today, we're going to think in particular about defining some of those processes that will help better govern the reporting and analytics solutions that you have in place or that you're in the process of putting in place. So with that then, what do we mean by governance? And this is another place where some people will jump automatically just to data governance or the definition of data elements, or it might be best practices. But I think we're going to try to use the term a little bit more holistically today. So the definition of governance. The action or manner of governing, not very helpful, not very descriptive, but if we take that word kind of govern down, we get to something that's a little bit more useful for us. So to conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of something, a state, an organization, people, in this instance of your BI and analytics practice. So that's a definition that I think we can work with a bit, and that's in the light that we'll be thinking about governance today. So why do we need governance as part of this strategy? Well, the objective of any good BI and analytics solution is really to drive business value, right? So it's maybe to increase revenues, to reduce costs, or maybe to mitigate risks or be compliant. And with self-service becoming more and more of the norm for companies, we see that when investments are made in BI and analytics platforms, organizations often have a tendency to kind of go towards one of two directions. So one, some people will be very acutely aware of the inherent risk in giving people access to the company's information. That information might be private or sensitive if shared, and they may fear what happens if people have the ability to do whatever they want with it. They may fear giving people the ability to create their own data models and spread the wrong information out in the company. These companies tend to lean more towards the side of trying to lock everything down, make it as secure as possible, mitigate the risk of any potential chaos, but at the same time, that puts a bit of a constraint on the organization and minimizes the value of the solution to the business. On the other end of the spectrum, though, there are people whose reporting and analytics kind of quickly turns into the Wild West or maybe a bit of a free-for-all, if you will. They may want their solutions to be as open as possible and encourage a lot of collaboration and sharing and authoring. And that's really because these organizations tend to be very heavily guided by the reward of what a solution like that can provide. And so there are a lot of benefits to that. However, this approach, if it's not governed properly, can become a bit too unfettered. And so you may find that you've got many reports that are all saying the same thing, or I guess even worse, many reports that are all saying different things or slightly different things. You may run into privacy or compliance issues if you're not in control of what data a user can access and you're not monitoring how that data is being shared with others. And so what we find is that without a governance strategy, you're likely to find yourself on one end of this spectrum, because without solid thought and judgment on how you govern different points, it's easier really to take an extreme side, so to say, lock everything down, or let's give them the data and see what happens. And so you really need a good governance strategy, because it will allow you to have the conversations in your organization and to think thoughtfully about the different elements so that you can balance those two things. And you can keep them in balance throughout. So you can make sure that as new opportunities arise or as new risks arise, that you're working them into your governance strategy. And so now we'll think about what are some of the key considerations that you might have when devising that strategy. So the first thing we're going to look at is, in order to successfully govern things, what is really needed and what are the responsibilities of any successful governing body? You can think about this obviously in terms of business intelligence and analytics, but it's sort of true for anything. So the first thing that's needed is really a definition of standards and processes. So we have seen that this is an area that can be a bit challenging for a number of our customers because it can sometimes lead to somewhat academic conversations about the best way to do things. And it's easy to kind of get too lost in trying to define every standard or every process, or thinking a little bit too conceptually about things without being that practical about them. So getting to a place where you can kind of practically define standards and processes is really important. And we will share some guidance for ways that you can do that and the sample approach for that in a few slides. Once you've defined those standards and the processes for governing your organization, it's really important that those processes get shared, so that the laws kind of are shared with the citizens, and then that they're enforced. So who's making sure that those laws are understood and that they're being abided by? If you expect people to be able to follow them, you really need to make sure that they know what the rules are. And what we find is in this landscape where users are really obtaining more and more freedom, the value of user empowerment becomes much, much stronger. And we tackled user empowerment in a previous session, so feel free to listen to that recording if you're interested to hear more about that. But what we do find oftentimes is that ensuring that the best practices or standards or processes that are in place around governance, if those are defined and shared as part of a user training or user empowerment program, that starts to mitigate some of the risks that you see. So if everybody knows how to use things responsibly and in a shared understanding of what's responsible, then it becomes a lot easier to make sure that that's happening and that that's enforced. And the other thing is around here giving people what they need to be able to enforce those standards and to use those standards. So for example, it's important that everybody use the same definition of certain metrics, providing them something like a data dictionary or having somewhere that information is published and easily accessible is very important. And then the last bit is really around monitoring adherence and adapting the definitions and standards and processes as makes sense. So any of these processes and standards will evolve in time. If we think back even a decade ago, self-service wasn't nearly as prevalent as it was today. And so many organizations have needed to adapt their governance strategies for what it looks like in this new world. And as we see new technologies start to kind of challenge the boundaries of what needs to be governed and what doesn't, it's really important to make sure that the strategies are adapting with it. So when you see a tool like Power BI, for example, that has really strong collaboration capabilities, it starts to lead organizations to have to work out, well, what is the approach for governing the way that people share things? Can somebody author a report and share it with absolutely anybody? And so making sure that the standards that are in place are being adhered to, but also that they're adapting appropriately will be really important. And what we'll find usually, I think, in this section is that if you are monitoring adherence and people are struggling with it a bit, it's usually one of two things. It's that either people are struggling to apply the standards you've put in place, so maybe the standards aren't practical or it's unreasonable, and that's really good feedback to have to work into the adaptation of this. Or it may be that they are applying the standards, but they're finding that that's limiting them too much and they're not getting the full value of it. So getting a lot of feedback at this point is really important. So what are some of the areas that you might consider when thinking about your governance strategy? And I'm going to put these up on the screen, but this is not a comprehensive list. It's just a sampling of some of the things that you might want to consider. And the reason I put this up here is to demonstrate that there really are a number of areas that you'll have to consider when thinking about how you govern some of these solutions. So things like security and permissions. How do you determine how people get access to a certain tool or to a data set? What can you allow them to have? End user authoring and data modeling. What do you want to allow? Can users create their own data models? If they do, can they share them? Do they have to be signed off or go through a quality assurance process before they get shared? And then when they are shared, are they differentiated or delineated from IT-generated content in any way? So is there something that certifies user content or lets user content be shared but indicates to users that it isn't certified? So there are a number of different things on this list here that you might consider when thinking about a governance strategy that will really work for you. And because this list is that list is long and just a sampling of it, I think it's really important to have some key considerations when you are trying to define this governance strategy. So in working with a number of customers on their BI governance strategies, we've really honed in on kind of 4 critical considerations that underpin a successful strategy. So first is that the strategy really needs to be practical, and the standards really need to be rooted in actual use cases. If it's impractical, it will be very difficult to get people to adopt those standards and to follow those processes. And we do see this as kind of a common pitfall of many governance strategies, where people might develop the strategy in a vacuum and never really consider the real-life application of the strategy. And as I mentioned before, we've seen some companies embark on a governance initiative only to get kind of bogged down by some of the conversations that happen around the best way to do things. It becomes so academic or philosophical that it's really no longer kind of practical, and we've seen a lot of governance strategies kind of stall at that point or really need some help in identifying kind of what's most important. Which leads us to the next one, really, which is that the strategy should really be prioritized. I flashed just 12 or 16 topics on the last slide. There are a number of different areas where you can consider processes that have to be in place to help with your governance, and really bubbling up the ones that are going to be most critical to your organization. It's very important. So you may do this by thinking, which ones are you most at risk of doing something kind of wrong or against security policies or against privacy policies if you don't do anything about it? Or you may want to also find the ones that are most likely to kind of hamper some of the rewards that you would get out of the solution if you don't do something to change it. So making sure that you're getting to priority is really important, because it'll stop you from not taking any steps on your governance strategy while you try to work everything else out. And then the third one is that it's balanced, and that's really important to make sure that it addresses all needs, so including the people, data, and tools that we talked about a few slides ago, but also making sure that the balance is correct in terms of the right level of restriction versus the right level of freedom. And that might change. That might not be a blanket decision for every application with your organization. That might change based on the business function. It might change based on the data that's involved in it. And so it's really important to think about what is balance in any particular scenario, and how do you kind of define governance in a way that it can be followed, but it's not so rigid that it can't work with a number of different scenarios. And then the last one is really bespoke. So a lot of times we'll have customers coming to us saying, tell us what the best practices are for Tableau, or tell us what the best practices are for delineating IT and user-generated content. But there are a number of considerations with any of those topics, but there is no one right answer. And it's oftentimes going to be dependent upon what's needed within that organization. So if you're just picking up standards and governance from another company, it's very unlikely that it's going to fit. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of approach, and it's really important that each organization considers their needs kind of very specifically. And so with these principles in mind, we've used an approach to help kind of define the processes for governance that we've worked with a number of different organizations with. And so in this next section, I'm just going to take you through what that sample approach looks like. And like I said, these solutions will be slightly different for every organization, but this will give you a bit of a framework to consider for one way that you may go about starting to define some of these processes in your organization. So the first thing to note is really that developing a governance strategy for your organization is going to be a journey. You're not going to just set out, do it all on day one, and then on day two have it all implemented. It's going to continue to evolve over time. And we've worked with our customers to develop customized governance strategies that meet the unique needs of their organization. When we do that, the first step is really to create a list of governance items that are important to the organization and to consider the processes that may need to be in place to uphold those governance items. So we talked about a couple of areas where you might consider this, but it's important to just kind of brainstorm and bring people together in your organization to come up with a baseline set of these items. Then once we've collected all the potential items, it's important to bring together the right people to discuss the key objectives of the governance strategy and what it is that they want to accomplish. And we find it's really important to include the relevant sponsors in here, both from IT and from the business, to ensure that the technical possibilities are really aligning with the business goals. We find that when these strategies are defined in isolation, either the business trying to define it or just IT trying to define it, it can be a bit unbalanced. So it's really important to kind of bring perspectives from both of those groups together. And then once we have that group together and some of our main objectives in mind, we work with our clients to help them prioritize that list based on what's important and also what's urgent to the organization and to the key sponsors. And we try to map out as well what tools or technologies are relevant for those. By prioritizing that list, it really helps us ensure that the most critical items are addressed first, but that we're not kind of foregoing the holistic nature of the strategy. And then after we've kind of prioritized those governance items, what we look to do is to find a couple representative use cases within the business that can serve as a basis for testing your governance strategy. And by doing this, we really look to ensure that the standards we're going to design are rooted in practical applications and developed alongside real business users. And so these examples could be anything from one particular, say, finance application to kind of the whole end-to-end process that somebody might go about engaging in that application. So it may be everything from onboarding users for that application, defining how users can access the data, defining if they can create the reports, how they access the reports, how you monitor the usage of those reports, if they can collaborate on those reports. So your use cases here could be kind of end-to-end so that you're fleshing out the processes and governance items that will be necessary along each step of the way. And so once we've kind of got those practical use cases, that's where we start to set some initial standard definitions. And that's where you'll map out some of the things that I just discussed, or whatever items really need to be worked out for that particular use case. Once you've come to your kind of first set of them, it's really important to then test them back on the use cases we've defined to see, is it practical? Does it give us the end that we're kind of hoping for in it? And then obviously once we get to that point, you'll need to iterate on it quite a bit to make sure that we're getting it to a point that it's optimized, that it's not too restrictive, that it's not too open and free, that it's enough of a process to gain control, but not so much of a process that it hampers the value of it or is adding to the timeline of it. So iterating on it to get it right is really important. And then once we get to a point that we're happy with it, you can release the first version of this. The strategy can be released more widely in the organization. Oftentimes we find the rollout of that to be very helpful if you do it with coaching or training for your users. And here we think it's really critical to consider getting the right people involved to ensure that the governance strategy is properly adopted. And then the last bit of this is really setting up a forum for feedback to be captured and incorporated into the standard definitions. As I mentioned, these definitions will change over time, and as people evolve with using the technologies or the platforms you've put in place, some of these, you may want to evolve some of your processes as well. You might be happy to give people more freedom, or you may find that where you're giving freedom might need to be reined back a bit. So it's important to set up this feedback loop to keep iterating on these governance approaches so that it's not something that gets defined and then becomes outdated very quickly. So that'll kind of conclude the session for today. We did look at kind of the definitions of process and governance and why they're important for your strategy. Hopefully we gave you some considerations to consider when thinking about your governance strategy, ensuring that it's kind of balanced, prioritized in the right way. And then we showed a sample approach that we've used with customers for helping in the beginning stages to define some of the governance that needs to occur within the organization, or really providing some analysis on the governance that already occurs to work out where they may need to take the next step. And again, if you have any questions or you want to reach out for any more information, feel free to contact me either through my email address or the phone number there. My name is Amanda Teschko, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you guys might have through those means.